Laughter started before she even finished her sentence. Theodora Kwan-Osei had barely stepped off the elevator onto the 32nd floor when Senior Partner Malcolm Griffith looked up from his desk, saw her, and made a sound somewhere between a chuckle and a scoff, the kind of sound a man makes when he is absolutely certain the moment belongs to him. "Can I help you find something?" he said. Not a question, a dismissal dressed as one. Theodora set her leather portfolio on the reception counter. She did not smile. She did not apologize for existing. She simply said, "I have a 9 o'clock with the managing board." Malcolm Griffith leaned back in his chair. He was 61 years old, had been with Harwick Lorne Capital for 27 years, and he wore both of those facts like armor. He glanced at his assistant, Caroline, who was pretending to look at her screen. Then he looked back at Theodora, her natural hair, her age, the fact that she could not possibly be who she said she was, and he laughed again, properly this time. "The board meeting," he said slowly, "the way you speak to someone who has wandered into the wrong building. Sweetheart, that meeting is for senior partners and invited institutional stakeholders, not," he gestured vaguely at her, at all of her, "walk-ins." The word hung in the air. Theodora did not flinch. She reached into the front pocket of her portfolio and placed a single cream-colored card on the counter. She did not push it toward him. She simply let it sit there. Malcolm did not look at it. "I'm going to need you to take the elevator back down," he said. "If you're here about the junior analyst intake, that's handled through HR on the 4th floor." Behind him, through the glass wall of the main boardroom, Theodora could see the other senior partners beginning to settle into their seats. She recognized 2 of them from the annual report she had read on the flight from Vancouver. She had read everything. "I'll wait," she said. Malcolm's expression shifted. Not quite anger, something closer to the particular irritation of a man who was not used to being ignored. "I'm sorry?" "I said I'll wait." She picked up her card from the counter and tucked it back into her portfolio. "The meeting doesn't start for 4 minutes. I'm not in a rush." He stood up then, all 6 feet of him, pulling himself to full height the way men do when they've decided a situation needs to be managed physically. He walked around the desk and stood in front of her. "Young lady," he said, and the words were slow and deliberate, "I don't know who sent you up here or what you were told, but I have been running new partner orientation for this floor for 11 years, and I would know if there was someone." He paused, looked her over once more, "like you scheduled for today's meeting. Someone like you." He didn't say what he meant. He didn't have to. Theodora looked at him for a long moment. Not the way someone looks at a threat, the way someone looks at a question they have already answered. "Mr. Griffith," she said, and she said his name the way you say the name of something you've already categorized. "I would suggest you go check your email from the last 20 minutes. He blinked, just once. Something about the way she knew his name, without hesitation, without introduction, made a small crack in the wall of his certainty. But men like Malcolm Griffith do not let small cracks show. They paper over them. "I don't take instructions from Malcolm." The voice came from behind him. Franklin Lorne, 73 years old, co-founder of Harwick Lorne Capital, stood in the doorway of the boardroom with his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and an expression that Caroline, watching from her desk, would later describe as the quietest kind of fury she had ever seen in 30 years of working in that office. Malcolm turned. "Malcolm," Franklin said again, and this time the word had weight to it. "Would you like to explain to me why our keynote stakeholder is standing in the reception area instead of seated at my table?" The room went very still. Malcolm's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Theodora. He looked at Franklin. He looked at the glass-walled boardroom where 8 senior partners were now watching through the window, some with confusion, some with the dawning horror of people who are beginning to understand what they are witnessing. She didn't have. He stopped. Started again. She didn't identify herself. "She left you her card," Franklin said. He had clearly already been told. "You left it on the counter." Malcolm looked down. The cream-colored card was still there, where Theodora had set it and he had refused to pick up. He reached for it now. His hand was steady. He would give himself that much, but the color had drained from his face with a thoroughness that was almost medical. The card read, Theodora Kwan-Osei, Chief Investment Officer, Meridian North Capital Partners, Vancouver, BC. And below that, in smaller text, representing a $2.3 billion stake in the Harwick Lorne acquisition proposal. Malcolm Griffith stood in the middle of the reception area of the company he had spent 27 years believing was his, holding a card that told him exactly how badly he had just miscalculated, and he did not say a single word. Theodora had grown up in Scarborough. Not the Scarborough people romanticize now that gentrification has made it interesting, but the Scarborough of the 90s, the Scarborough of her mother working double shifts at the hospital laundry, of her grandmother making groundnut soup on Sunday because it stretched the week further than anything else, of Theodora doing her homework at the kitchen table because their apartment didn't have a dedicated room for a thing as aspirational as studying. She had been the kid who read the business section of the Globe and Mail when her classmates were reading YM. Not because anyone told her to, because at 11 years old, she had looked at the world around her and made a quiet, private calculation. The people who built things had more control over their lives than the people who worked inside them. She wanted to build things. Her grandmother Abena had a saying she repeated so often it had worn a groove in Theodora's memory. Don't ask for a seat at the table. Learn to buy the table. Abena had said it first about a different kind of injustice, the kind that had followed their family from Accra to London to Toronto across 3 generations, but Theodora had always understood it as instruction, specific, actionable instruction. She had studied finance at Queen's, graduated first in her cohort, moved to Vancouver at 24 for a position at a boutique investment firm where she was, for 3 years, the only woman on the analytical team and one of 2 people of color in the entire company. She had kept her head down and her work impeccable. She had taken every meeting, read every filing, stayed late enough that the security guard on nights knew her coffee order. At 29, she had left to co-found Meridian North Capital Partners with 2 colleagues who believed, as she did, that there was a particular kind of institutional investment being left on the table in mid-market Canadian acquisitions. They were right. By the time Theodora was 32, Meridian North was managing assets that made rooms of men twice her age sit up straighter when her name was mentioned. She knew the kind of room she was walking into at Harwick Lorne. She had walked into variations of it for 10 years. She had developed in that time a very specific and deliberate strategy for handling the Malcolm Griffiths of those rooms. She did not explain herself early. She did not correct assumptions in the moment they were made. She waited. She had learned, through years of exactly these situations, that there is a particular and irreversible quality to the moment when a man who underestimated you is forced to confront the scale of his error in front of an audience. Correcting him privately in a quiet corner gives him the gift of invisibility. Letting the room witness it costs him something he cannot recover. She was not a cruel person. She had never set out to humiliate anyone. But she had also stopped going out of her way to protect the comfort of people who had offered her none. Franklin Lorne walked her into the boardroom himself. He introduced her with the kind of precision that made clear he had memorized her file. He mentioned her undergraduate thesis. He mentioned the Meridian North Q4 report, which he said he had read twice. He pulled out her chair, not in the patronizing way, but in the old-fashioned way, the way you treat someone whose time you genuinely respect. Theodora sat down. Across the table, she counted 8 faces, most of them carefully neutral now, recalibrated. One woman, Senior Partner Isabelle Fontaine, late 50s, the kind of sharp that doesn't need to announce itself, gave Theodora a look that was not quite a smile but was something warmer and more specific. The look of someone who has been the only woman in enough rooms to recognize what they are watching. Malcolm Griffith had followed him in and taken his seat at the far end of the table. He had not spoken since the reception area. He was very still in the manner of a man trying to make himself occupy less space than he actually does. Franklin opened the meeting. For the next 40 minutes, Theodora spoke. She walked them through Meridian North's interest in the Harwick and Lorne acquisition proposal, the specific provisions that worked, the two she wanted renegotiated, the timeline she was prepared to commit to. She used numbers with the ease of someone for whom numbers had never been abstract. They were just the language she happened to be fluent in. She asked questions that were not hostile, but were precise enough that two of the senior partners had to consult documents they had clearly not expected to need. She was not trying to impress anyone. She had stopped trying to impress rooms full of strangers at 26. She was simply doing the work she had come to do. At one point, Franklin asked about the secondary capital structure, and Theodora opened her portfolio to reference a specific clause. As she did, the edge of a small notebook became visible, slim, dark green, initialed in gold along the spine. TKO. She didn't draw attention to it. She didn't need to. But Harold Bissett, seated 2 chairs down, had been staring at it since it appeared, trying to place the insignia, some latent recognition stirring in the back of his mind. He would spend the next week quietly looking it up. When he found it, the Kwan-Osei Foundation, endowed at Theodora's direction following the Meridian North Series B close, now one of the larger private educational grants in British Columbia, he would feel, sitting alone in his office, a specific variety of shame that no one witnessed and that he would therefore never have to name out loud. Some debts are paid in silence. The meeting ended at 11:14. Franklin shook her hand at the door and said they would have a formal response to her proposed amendments within 72 hours. He said it the way people say things they intend to follow through on. Theodora thanked him, collected her portfolio, and walked back through the boardroom toward reception. Malcolm Griffith was still at the table, alone now, the other partners having dispersed. He was looking at the surface of the table the way a man looks at something when he is actually looking at nothing, when the looking is just a thing his eyes are doing while his mind processes a damage assessment. She could have walked past him. She had considered it, somewhere in the abstract future of how this morning might go, and she had decided, before she ever stepped off the elevator, that she would not. She stopped beside his chair. He looked up. "Mr. Griffith," she said. Her voice was level. No warmth, but no performance of coldness either. Just a person who had something to say and was choosing to say it. "I've been in rooms like this one for 10 years. I will be in rooms like this one for 40 more. I'm not asking you to understand how that happened. I'm just telling you it's true." She left him with that. In the elevator on the way down, she pressed the button for the lobby and stood with her back straight and her portfolio in both hands and let out a breath that she had been, she realized, holding since approximately the moment the doors had opened on the 32nd floor. Not because she had been afraid. She hadn't been afraid since she was 19, and something in her had quietly shifted during a late-night reading of a letter her grandmother had sent from Accra, a letter that said, in Abina's looping handwriting, "The world will make you small if you allow it. You are not required to allow it." She hadn't been afraid. She was just tired, in that specific way that people are tired when they have had to spend energy being twice as prepared and half as fragile as the situation required. Energy that should have been available for other things. The elevator opened at the lobby. She walked out into the September morning air on Bay Street, Toronto, sharp and cold and full of itself, and she thought about calling her mother. Decided she would later. For now she had a noon flight back to Vancouver and a partner meeting at 4 and a foundation board call at 6, and the world was, as it had always been, very full of work that needed doing. 3 weeks later, 2 things happened on the same day. The first, Harwick Lorne Capital sent a formal letter of acceptance of Theodora's amended acquisition terms. All 2 of her proposed revisions had been incorporated without pushback. Franklin Lorne added a handwritten note at the bottom of the signed page. 3 lines, nothing elaborate, that said he hoped they would have the opportunity to work together again. he meant it. Theodora could tell the difference between someone who means a thing and someone who writes it out of obligation, and Franklin Lorne was a man who meant his words. The second, Malcolm Griffith announced his retirement from the firm. The announcement was framed as a planned transition, the language carefully neutral, the way corporate communications always are when the neutrality is doing significant heavy lifting. He had been with the firm for 27 years. The announcement thanked him for his service and wished him well in his next chapter. Theodora heard about it from Isabel Fontaine, who sent a brief email with no subject line and a single sentence, "Thought you'd want to know." Theodora read it at her desk in Vancouver, with a view of the mountains and a cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop. She sat with the information for a moment. She did not feel triumphant. She had learned by 32 that the moment when someone who wronged you faces consequences tends to arrive so quietly, so practically, so embedded in ordinary communications and normal business days that it rarely feels like anything at all. There is no music, there is no dramatic pivot. There is just an email with no subject line and a cup of coffee that has gone cold. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about her mother, still living in Scarborough, now in a house that Theodora had quietly helped her move into 3 years ago, the mortgage arranged in a way that cost her mother only dignity-preserving amounts. She thought about what it had taken to get from that kitchen table, with the homework spread across it, to this desk with this view and this work. She thought, they never make it easy. And then, as a second thought, arriving like the second beat of something, but they also never stop you, not forever. She picked up her coffee, took a sip even though it was cold, made a note in her calendar to call her grandmother on Sunday, and then she opened the next file on her desk because the work was never finished and she had never wanted it to be. Outside, Vancouver was doing what Vancouver does in October. Low clouds moving in off the water, the mountains going in and out of visibility, the light changing every 20 minutes, like a city that can't make up its mind. Theodora had lived here for 8 years and she still found it beautiful. That still surprised her a little, that there was still space, inside a life this full, to look out a window and notice the light. There is something worth sitting with in the story of a woman who was told she didn't belong in a room and then proceeded, quietly and without apology, to be the most important person in it. Not because of a dramatic confrontation. Not because of a dramatic confrontation. Not because she fought fire with fire. But because she had simply done the preparation, held the line, and let the truth of the situation become visible in its own time. She didn't need Malcolm Griffith to understand her. She never had. She just needed the room to see what she brought to it. And the room, eventually, always does. I keep thinking about that card. The cream-colored one Theodora set on the counter and didn't push forward, just left it there, flat on the surface, while a man with 27 years of certainty decided he didn't need to read it. That's the part that stays with me. Not the boardroom, not the moment Franklin Lorne walked out and the color left Malcolm Griffith's face. Those moments are satisfying in the way a closed door is satisfying, final, clean. But the card sitting there, untouched, while she stood and waited, that's where I think the real story lived. Because here's what I've come to understand, having sat with stories like Theodora's for a long time now, the outcomes we call justice aren't random. They follow something. They follow the shape of what people actually built, quietly over years, when no one was watching, or applauding, or making it easy. Theodora didn't walk into that 32nd floor by accident. She walked in carrying a decade of staying late and reading the filings no one else read and saying yes to the rooms that made her feel unwelcome because she understood that presence is its own kind of argument. That's what I'd call integrity. Not the word on a wall plaque, but the private, unwitnessed kind. The kind that doesn't require an audience to hold its shape. And then there's the matter of how prepared she was. $2.3 billion doesn't move because someone showed up with good intentions and a firm handshake. It moves because someone did the work. Read the report twice. understood the secondary capital structure well enough to renegotiate 2 clauses before anyone else in the room had thought to question them. Malcolm Griffith looked at Theodora and saw someone who didn't belong. What he missed, what his assumption cost him, was the extraordinary quality of the mind that had already mapped the room before she stepped into it. That's the thing about genuine understanding. It doesn't announce itself. It just becomes visible, eventually, to anyone paying enough attention. And then the staying power. I think about her grandmother's letter. The way that one line, "You are not required to allow it," became something Theodora carried, not as inspiration, but as instruction, sustaining something over years, over rooms full of people who have already decided what you are. That requires a kind of endurance that doesn't get celebrated the way it should. It's not dramatic. It doesn't make for a clean story beat. It just means showing up, again, to the next thing, and the next, until the accumulation of all that quiet showing up becomes undeniable. Malcolm Griffith retired 3 weeks later. I don't think that was a punishment exactly. I think it was the natural conclusion of a life built on assumptions rather than attention. What you refuse to look at doesn't disappear. It just grows large enough that eventually it becomes the whole room. Theodora picked up her cold coffee and opened the next file. That's the part I find the most true.